Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're from. Welcome to a session on climate crisis fuels rising violence against children, evidence across child protection research. As people continue trickling in, we'll give a few more minutes to have to allow more colleagues to come in. But meanwhile, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're from, which organization you're from, you work with in the chat. As we wait for more colleagues to join, as you might have you might have noticed the session is being recorded, and we're going to have the session recording available on the Alliance YouTube channel with multilingual transcriptions later on. So we're going to put the link to the, we will put the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. So please feel free to subscribe and stay tuned until the session recording becomes available. And then if you speak other languages, you should be able to watch it in other languages than English. After the session, we are hoping to create a mini meeting summary that we'd like to share with the participants and then others who couldn't join or who can't join the session today. So in the meeting summary, we are hoping to collect your comments, reflections, or good practices you share in the chat and made publicly available. So if you think your statement reflections shouldn't be in there, it would be great if you can note that, or please do not include any sensitive information there. And sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Manami Kawamoto. I'm from the Alliance Secretariat, and I'm the focal point from the Alliance Secretariat on Group of Friends on Climate Crisis and Child Protection. We are okay with those housekeeping. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Hani Mansourian, the Director of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action, who will kick us off on this session. So, floor is yours. Over to you, Hani.
Great. Thank you so much, Manami. And hi, everyone. As Manami said, my name is Hani Mansourian, and I'm the Director of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. Delighted to be here speaking with all of you on this very important topic on the impacts of climate crisis on violence against children and protection of children in general. As we know, that climate crisis is a crisis that mostly affects children and the protection of children. Children contribute the least to the climate crisis, as we all know, yet they are the most affected, and they will continue being affected throughout their lives. We know that around 1 billion children across the globe, nearly half of the total number of children in the world, are at this extreme risk of impact of the climate crisis. They're exposed to repeated heat waves, floods, storms, and droughts that threaten their safety, dignity, and future. Every year, environmental factors that take the lives of 1.7 million children under the age of 5. That's an astounding number. In 2024 alone, 242 million students across 85 countries experienced school closures or severe interruptions due to extreme climate events, with the most severe impact in South Asia and continued devastating impact in East and Southern Asia, exacerbating an existing learning crisis with direct consequences for protection and well-being of these children. Meanwhile, over 700 million children now live with high or very high water scarcity, increasing risk of disease, displacement, and exploitation. Despite these realities, only 2.4% of climate finance includes child-responsive interventions. many sectors that are critical to children, such as climate responsive social protection and climate education, are virtually unfunded. Climate crisis is also expected to be more widespread between 2025 and 2059, with 8 times as many children exposed to extreme heat waves and 3 times as many exposed to extreme river floods compared to the 2000s. These are not just abstract numbers. These are difficult realities on how the climate crisis reshapes lives of children and their families far beyond their control. The 2025 humanitarian funding cut that took the entire sector basically by a bit of a surprise created a very tough situation for all actors. Significant reductions in humanitarian funding forced humanitarian agencies to reduce the scale of programming by reach and location, or even worse, to shut down programs, including in countries prone to the climate crisis. The recent survey that we did as the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action shows us that 84% of overall respondents to our survey, which was over 400 respondents, 84% of them experienced operational budget cuts in the area of child protection specifically. National and local organizations were affected the most, with 88% of national organizations and 87% of local organizations having lost significant funding. 73% of respondents reported an increase in child protection risks over the past year, including mental health and psychosocial well-being at over 54%, sexual and gender-based violence at almost 50%, and physical and emotional maltreatment at 46%. Available resources are shrinking while needs are ever increasing. Now, what are we going to do today? Today, we are going to talk about research from India, Kenya, Ethiopia border areas, and across Southern Africa region that proves that climate shocks are creating predictable and preventable pathways to harm for children's safety and well-being. Across contexts, we will see similar patterns of economic stress, displacement, disrupted education, unsafe migration, child labor, child marriage, gender-based violence, and breakdown of community and household protection systems during and after climate shocks. I'm delighted to have 5 distinguished speakers with us, Associate Professor Neil Hart and Dr. Mona Ibrahim from University of Oxford, Isabella Turner, Research Advisor at Terre des Hommes, Netherlands, Atia Bose, Principal Lead, Child Protection and founding member of Aangan, a national NGO in India, Nabil Nube, Food Security and Livelihood Global Lead for Plan International. After the initial presentation from our speakers, we'll move into a panel discussion, inviting also another colleague, Audrey Otelli, who is the Child Protection and Education Officer from IFRC, the International Federation for Red Cross, to explore some questions that I will mention when we get to that point. And after that, we will have time for Q&A. So feel free to post your questions as the speakers are speaking. If your question comes up, please post it. Don't wait for the Q&A. We can park it and then get to it when the Q&A time comes. You can also specifically say which speaker you would like to address your question. We would love to hear your good practices, challenges, and any other reflections on this topic in the chat as well. With that, I would like to invite the first panel members to get us started. So Neil Hart from, actually, I believe, yes, Audrey and Nobile, right? No, sorry. Just going to go back. Yes, Neil Hart and Mona. I invite you guys to get us started. Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Hani, for that introduction. It's a great privilege to be here to be able to present the work that we've been doing in the last 6 months or so, which is really inspired by questions that the Alliance has been asking on quantifying links between climate risks and, in this case, sexual violence, sexual exploitation of adolescents. The work that we present, myself and my colleague Mona will present, is the outcome of a lot of excellent work that PhD students and postdocs here in the University of Oxford have been doing in conversation with many partners of the Alliance. This work is led by Lucy Kluver in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, with co-lead from myself in geography and Seth Flaxman in computer science. Next slide, please. So, as many of you know, the planet has been warming. This isn't big news. If you have a look, you can see that Africa is warming, as are many other places. But even the moderate warming that you might see, for example, in Malawi in the middle of Africa, 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, over 50 years, which is what these trends represent, that amounts to a 1 degree change. Next slide, please. And if we think about the distribution of daily temperatures, we go from cool to warm. If you click again, next slide, yeah, and we go again. You can keep clicking through that. We can think about the 1960s having the chance of a temperature in a particular location might be 40 degrees Celsius one day each summer. And if we move forward 50 years, so click a few more times, we end up seeing that likelihood of 40 degrees Celsius, just because the temperature on average has warmed 1 degree, you can click a few more times, it might be 5 days each summer. Click through to the next slide. And that is an intergenerational risk, which Wim Thierry really nicely wrote about in a 2021 paper, where my children are going to have a 7 times greater exposure to heat wave risk during their lifetimes than their grandparents will. And the outcome of that is going to be more heat waves. So if we click a few more times, yep, more droughts, greater risk of crop failures, and more floods, river floods. We move forward. You add on the fact that in terms of the population projections, while the most children might exist currently within Asia, Africa is going to continue to rise. And by 2050, there's going to be 1 billion children and adolescents across the continent. Click again. And what this means is that Africa in the coming years is likely to end up with the most children exposed to climate extremes and associated risks by the middle of the century. We can carry on clicking. And what we're trying to do in this project is simply quantify, given present observations, how strongly heat and drought modify baseline risks to adolescents of violence. Click again. I'm not going to talk about this other than there are many pathways by which this might happen, and we are trying to understand how this is playing out. Okay, over to Mona. Go next slide.
Thank you, Neil. So we know that this affects children. We know that the climate emergencies are also child protection emergencies. Hani mentioned a few statistics earlier in the call, but these are just some more really alarming numbers that are coming up of displacement, of exposure across the world, especially in the poorest countries. And this report also highlights, published by the Alliance, also highlights that this is not just directly affecting children. Extreme climate stress is not just affecting children, it's affecting all the infrastructure that protects them against violence, which adds an extra challenge. Next slide. So this research is still in progress, but these are some of the risk pathways we've started to acknowledge and recognize. And what's really kind of becoming clear is that all children are at risk, but there are subgroups that might be more at risk than others. Some of the risk mechanisms are mechanisms that we already know increase violence against children that just become extra amplified during climate emergencies. And one question for you, for everyone on this call, is what do you think would be good prevention strategies? How can we disrupt the pathway from climate hazards to violence against children. These are just some thoughts that we have listed there, but this is still like hypothesized. So it would be good to hear from your experience on this. Next slide. So this was research led by our colleague, Dr. Buthayna Tidjani, where we looked at kind of 5 different countries, at the violence against children surveys, the VAX surveys, and then compared them against rates of extreme drought. Now, when we kind of disaggregated for gender, it became clear that there's almost a 3-fold increase in violence against girls who are living in droughts. This already starts to show the magnitude of the issue. We know children are affected. Now we know how badly they're affected. Next slide. When we started to dive in a bit more, and this is just kind of one subgroup of girls who were married as children, we start to see even kind of more amplified risks across children who are married early. So in this particular analysis, Buthayna also found that girls who are married as children, who are also out of education, are 4 times more likely to be exposed to violence against children. Next slide. One thing that was consistent across quantitative evidence is that there are invisible populations, and I think this is a challenge for everyone in this room and more widely, where how do we really start to see the marginalized children across these data sets? And this would require kind of a really concerted effort across both humanitarian and development actors and local kind of data systems as well. Next slide. So these are just some of our initial key takeaways, but it would be lovely to hear from you in the chat on what do you think could be done about this issue. I always say that research only shows half of the story. Your experience in practice on the field would show us the other half, hopefully. Thank you. And this is back to Hani.
Great. Thank you very much for this very impressive research and the data that supports, as you said, what colleagues are seeing in the field and in the day-to-day realities of children and their families. I particularly liked the depiction of how the most vulnerable children often end up being, even when we are intentional about understanding the harm to children, they end up being the invisible ones in there. So, and hopefully that can be, to a certain extent, amended by the experience that comes from the field, because those that are on a daily contact with children potentially have a better chance of being able to expose those vulnerabilities. Thank you again, both of you, Neil and Mona. I would like to hand over to Isabella Turner, who will speak to us about the climate change and child exploitation risks on the Kenya-Ethiopia border area. Over to you, Isabella.
Great, thanks, Hani. And it's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm presenting today research that was conducted by the DSOM Netherlands and also strategies for Northern Development. This research, if you can go to the next slide, is a longitudinal study. So it started in 2024, where we had like a qualitative part. We did focus group discussions with children and with caregivers. And then in 2025, we had a quantitative and a qualitative part where we did a survey and also FGDs, focus group discussions with children from the ages of 10 to 15. From the survey from 5 to 14. And the FGDs were quite participatory as well, because we wanted to understand the impact of drought on children, families, and communities. And also we noticed that there was a big gap in the literature of actually understanding how children felt about the impact of climate change on their lives, and how and what solutions they imagine. So if you can go to the next slide. For this presentation, since we only have 5 minutes, I decided to focus only on the more qualitative part, so I can also highlight a bit of the stories of the children and also only the impacts on the children. But if you want to read the report, you can find the rest. So we found an increased amount of child labor. And of course, there's a level of child labor, such as like of support of parents, such as domestic work or herding livestock, that is normal. But what we found was that children were working more, and this was impacting their school. Many of them left their school, was also impacting their psychological well-being, and they were feeling a strong sense of responsibility. So many of them weren't seeing the point of going to school anymore, and they only saw themselves more as an adult having responsibilities at home. So we saw increase in herding livestock, domestic labor, seeking casual labor, so also migrating to find casual labor in the city, and also begging, especially in IDP camps. So yeah, another important thing to mention that these are pastoralist communities, and because of the drought, many of them were displaced into IDP camps. And we also saw an increased amount of child marriage and some cases of sexual exploitation of children as well. And with this was especially in IDP camps of cases that parents were concerned of young girls receiving gifts such as food or mobile phones from older men. And also we saw other cases of child physical abuse, child trafficking, and like I said, school dropout. And we saw that the pathways for this were mostly economic stress and livelihood collapse, also gender norms that led to sexual exploitation, but also child marriage, also mobility and migration, and psychological distress and coping pathways. So basically two things happening at the same time, breakdown of protective systems and also an increase in stressors. So if you move to the next slide, you can find a little story that a group of children aged 5 to 7 created in Ethiopia that really illustrates well what I've been saying. So Shala is 7 years old. When drought forced his family to leave their home, he had to drop out of school. Now, instead of learning and playing, Shala spends his days working in the market and herding other people's cows. The heavy work makes him tired, and he feels sad because he misses school and the chance to be with his friends. So this is an important finding that we had, is that children are not having time to be children anymore. They have a lot of work and a big sense of responsibility. And that's why they are having like a compressed childhood because of the impact of the drought. So moving to the next slide. Of course, not every child is impacted the same way. So we noticed that children in IDP camps were especially at risk, especially the ones that were child-led households. They were facing hunger, unsafe shelter, a lack of clean water. We also noticed gender differences. Girls were more at risk of early marriage and heavy domestic work, while boys were sent far away and also worked at different places. We also saw that children with disabilities face stigma and exclusion, like this caregiver in Ethiopia showed, said, if a child is disabled, people think they are a burden. They don't get food or education like others. So moving to the next slide. Thanks. So climate change is a child protection issue. It amplifies every vulnerability. So hunger, displacement, loss of income, destroys protective environments such as schools close, safe spaces disappear, caregivers and families have extreme stress, conflicts as well inside and outside of the home. It creates new risks, like we said, grooming linked to aid, control of resources, dangerous labor, unsafe migration routes. It also undermines our programs, right? We saw how climate shocks erased years of progress in education, livelihoods, well-being overnight. And like you saw in the story about Shala, the children are telling us that climate change is changing their childhoods. They're having less time to be children, to go to school and to play, and they're having more responsibility and more exposure to harm. So if we ignore climate change, we're ignoring one of the biggest drivers of harm and exploitation that children are facing today. So if we can just move to the next slide. Yeah. And here you can access our fact sheet. I think it's also in the chat. And if you have any questions, please just add it to the chat.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Really helpful findings. But just to highlight that element that you mentioned, and it was very clear in Shala's story of how climate crisis, like many other kind of risk multipliers, initiate a certain number of risks that then keep leading to from one risk to the next, to the next, to the next. So it kind of unleashes a chain of adversity that some children will fall into, and it will be very difficult to come out of. And it's not just one thing that happens to them, it's one after another, because they all share risk factors. So very important point. With that, I would like to hand over to Atiya Bose, who will talk to us about a cross-sectional study that examines the nexus between recurrent disasters and heightened risk of harm faced by children. Over to you, Atiya. Look forward to hearing you.
Thanks very much, Hani, and it's a great privilege for me to be here today. Good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is where you are. We can move to the next slide, please. I work at a child protection organization. It's a national child protection organization, and we were working in the region of West Bengal, which has very high levels of child marriage and child trafficking anyway, to begin with. In 2020-21, there were two cyclones in quick succession, Cyclone Amphan and Cyclone Yas. And we saw firsthand the utter devastation that they caused. We were not people who'd been thinking about climate up to that point. But I think once we saw that, and we saw what happened to the communities, we saw the losses that people bore, and also just the loss to the work that had gone in thus far, that I think it made it so that we couldn't stop seeing the connection between the climate crisis and child protection. West Bengal is 15 out of the 23 districts are hugely exposed to climate, to climate shocks. In between 1970 and 2019, the cyclone frequency has increased 5 times. So that's the kind of situation that West Bengal is. And the little red dot, that's the Sundarbans, a highly fragile part of the state of West Bengal that's doubly exposed. Our work is in that region, and I'm going to be talking about the work that we've been doing and a study. And everything that I'm talking about is coming out of working in the field with communities. So the methodology for this study is really us trying to do a situational analysis. Like, we saw the risk, we saw the devastation, and we were just trying to understand, as we were talking to families, how were communities who had been through this time and time again, how were they experiencing this? What was their understanding? what were people thinking about at a household level, at a child level, and at a sort of local government level. So we spoke to the studies based on FGDs and focus group discussions and surveys with 608 households in the region. So we spoke to 600 adult caregivers and 308 adolescents. And we also spoke to local government authorities in the area. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So, I mean, just jumping straight to it, right? Obviously, the conversation that we were having is post the disaster and the devastation and the loss of livelihood and everything that everyone has talked about in terms of the economic instability. We asked people, what is it that you've done to manage? What have you done to manage? So the first things people very easily talked about, 23%, as you can see, talked about selling assets, formal loans. 31% of people talked about migration. What became harder to do, what became harder to understand, was asking people to talk about the impact this had on children and their children's well-being. It was only honestly because families just couldn't make an immediately connect disasters with either child labor or child marriage. And it's only through indirect questioning that we were able to see that up to 21% of households had to either get a child married, put into labor, or pulled out of school in order to cope with the financial impact of the disasters. But it was not something that they were able to automatically talk about themselves. If we can go to the next slide. So families, up to 21% of families talked about resorting to adverse coping mechanisms that impacted their children adversely. But when you try to analyze that a bit, to understand underreporting. So if you look at this, the numbers in black, that's what adults are reporting is the situation for themselves and their own children. The numbers in the gray boxes are what they are reporting is happening to the community. So right there, you can even see families saying, this is not something I had to do, but I know it happened in my community. And those numbers are significantly higher. What's very telling is that when we spoke to children and adolescents, they had a different take altogether. Up to 23% of children and adolescents said that they had experienced these pressures themselves. And if you look at the numbers in red, 65% of children we spoke to said they knew, 65, 75, and 38 talked about that this was happening to other kids that they knew closely, so to their peer group. And I think it's important here for us to look at these numbers because none of those numbers is exactly true or untrue. The truth lies somewhere in between. For adults, there is a great sense of shame and guilt and fear around reporting on taking these adverse circumstances because families look at those as something that's their fault. There's very little ability, and this is not just because families don't have the ability, but I think that the politics makes it so that these coping mechanisms seem like individual choices rather than the fact that there was no one to step into the breach. And so this is what families were forced to do. So I think it's really important for us to understand the real story by looking at how these three different people are talking about the numbers and in terms of how they coped with the stress. If we can go to the next slide. Something that young people talked very extensively about. So we can say that they talked about the fact that there's great pressure to be pulled out of school, to be sent to work, to be married off early. But then there were also these other risk factors that they talked about. 83% of adolescents said that they know someone who's now using substances. More dangerous, 85% of adolescents knew someone who had run away or was threatening to run away. I think it's important to look at this because, in qualitative discussions with young people revealed a widespread feeling of hopelessness among youth. lack of aspirations, and a diminished belief in the utility of education. These combined with lack of supervision and financial desperation is leading to all sorts of risk-taking behavior from children. When we asked about trafficking, when we asked direct questions about the increase in child trafficking, no one did actually comment on it, but 23% of households did say that there's been an increase in the number of agents, the people who come, offering jobs and offering job placements. And most of these were coming from outside the district. Now, anyone who works in trafficking and in disaster areas, we understand that there is sort of predatory behavior and agents coming in from outside and all kinds of job offers being made. And that is exactly what families are talking about. Even though they're not being able to name it as trafficking, they're certainly being able to say that there's a very, very huge increase in the number of agents who are soliciting and looking and offering jobs to children outside of the districts. If you look at the impact on mental health, I have to say, for my team and I, this was something that was a huge surprise. Not a huge surprise that this is what we found, but a huge surprise because in the 25 years that I've been working in child protection, and particularly in rural India, I have not heard families frame mental stress and mental well-being of their children. And across the board, we heard families talking about their children they're lonely, they have difficulty sleeping. They talked about children being angry, being more violent, being restless. Some talked about children completely withdrawing and not wanting to leave the house. 67%, of them talked about children being scared easily. This number, 79% feeling lonely, that's a number that comes directly from children. So children and adolescents talking increasingly about the sense of, existential dread, to be honest, but really just looking at the difficulties of it. Next slide, please.
Tia, it would be great if you can wrap up in a minute.
We're going to wrap up right now. This is just to talk about persisting impact. We look at harm, and we actually studied it to say that this harm stays. It's not just immediate. It's not just 2 months after. It's something that stays until even 2 years later. Next slide, please. Blind spots. This is super important because there's the objective reality of the harm on the ground, but the blind spots, the normalization of harm, the inability of communities and government structures to actually recognize that this is something that is climate induced and therefore requires a particular kind of engagement, is something that is completely missing and super important to highlight as a finding. Next slide, please. And here finally, just if you can sit for 10 seconds with voices from children, just to understand hopelessness, fear, and being burdened. And that's it, honey. I'm done.
Thank you so much. I was also reading those. Thank
we
you
don't
so
need
much.
That,
It was really a really great yet another kind of set of data. What really struck me was the comparison that you had done in terms of what parents report about others and then what children report. Because also I was intrigued by what Mona was talking about, the invisibility of certain types of children. Now you were talking about the invisibility of certain types of issues in a way. So they are both difficult. I like to call them as hard to reach populations and hard to measure issues. So I was very intrigued that you did that. And if there is time in the Q&A, I would love to explore that with both of you more. But just for the sake of time, since we are a bit over time, I would hand over to Nube, who will talk to us about practical insights from the field on climate crisis. Over to you, Nube.
Thank you, Hani, and thank you, Tia, for such kind of statistics and the hidden aspects of it. So I I'm going to talk about the practical aspects that we have seen happening in the field, and also the practical aspects that as implementers we face. My discussion will be, what are we seeing? What does integrated programming look like, combining food security, livelihoods, and child protection? And then we will also talk about a toolkit that Plan has worked together with other like organizations to develop that tries to teach practitioners on how to integrate child protection. Next slide, please. So if you look at how climate risk compounds vulnerability, which is what the other speakers have been talking about, and with examples, we see the climate shock and the cascading system failure that starts with that shock, which could be a drought, which could be a flood, and triggers the livelihood disruption. So incomes are lost. But it is not just about losing incomes, it's about the loss of the household's primary buffer against harm. Next stage leads to household stress, the displacement, the migration. When that buffer is gone, we see the final common pathway where child protection failures then come in. Your exploitation, child labor, family separations, all these become survival strategies. And the statistic is stark. In South Sudan, 87% of children are exposed to both high climate risk and child protection risks. Slide 3, please. So from slide 3, we're trying to see how things move from shocks to child protection outcomes. So we're trying to operationalize that pathway and say, okay, how does it look like? What is it that then happens to make all this lead to child protection outcomes? So it's the shock. It hits the food security sector. It hits the livelihood sector. Crops fail. Market prices spike. Assets are assets are lost. Assets are eroded. And this translates immediately into a household level reality. We don't have food. We've lost savings. For the child, it translates to measurable outcomes, school dropouts, to save fees or to continue to contribute family labor, increased child labor to bridge income gaps, malnutrition, and lifelong development consequences that we've seen the other speakers talk about. So the key takeaway out of that is that every disruption to the food security and livelihood sector has a direct, predictable impact on a child. So interventions that we bring in on food security and livelihoods, especially those that are climate-induced, they prevent the impact on children. Slide 4. What have we seen in Ethiopia where Plan has been implementing in the Afar regions? So wealthier households, not so much a problem if there is a hit, if there is a shock, moderate risk. They maintain pastoralism and face that moderate risk. The middle income, they diversify, they have options, but elevated vulnerability. But the poorest are forced to exit that livelihood system entirely. This group faces the highest protection risk. They are the ones who resort to negative coping strategies. And what do we see again? In Sudan, South Sudan, we see the malnutrition double P. It challenges the traditional lean season as we have known it. So it shows us that climate variability layered with conflict creates multiple unpredictable hunger spikes away from our normal lean seasons. But our models have not changed to that. Our response that must be equally as dynamic as what we are seeing on the ground. We implemented a program in Ethiopia, and I want to talk briefly about the experiences that we saw. Next slide. So from a drought response in Ethiopia, we derived 4 operational imperatives. We said, let's integrate from the beginning. A joint child protection food security risk assessment should happen before we write the program, but it should not be an afterthought. The use of cash as a prevention, unconditional cash transfers. They didn't just buy food, they prevented school dropouts, they prevented child marriages, they stabilized the household economy. intentional targeting, because 70% of livestock recipients were female-headed households, and this directly reduced gendered vulnerabilities by putting resources in the hands of primary caregivers. The link to systems. So livelihood support alone is not enough. We strengthened community-based protection committees to handle identification and referrals when risks did emerge. I will talk again about how integration looks like in practice. Next slide. So some of the what we think are the practical points that one needs to take into consideration to cover climate mitigation, food security, child protection risk, and that. Cash management and cash can be used to reduce the risk of separation due to neglect, especially if families are enrolled early into case management and then combined with irregular cash transfers. You remove the economic driver for protection violation. Then protection-sensitive livelihoods. For instance, if livestock are distributed or seeds are distributed, and embedding a do-no-harm approach, embed child protection training modules into that distribution, it helps. It also makes sure that the communities recognize the risk while they are being given tools to recover. System strengthening, I've touched on that, working with ministries, working with agriculture technologists at the local level. This breaks down silos within government structures. Gendered pathways as well, women economic empowerment, engaging men in sessions as well. If mothers get resources and fathers shift behaviors, then you resolve the issue on balanced childcare and a collective burden. Nutrition-protected interventions. Integrating CMAM, which is your community-managed the acute malnutrition and the infant and young child feeding practices. You integrate responsive caregiving. You teach caregivers to provide psychosocial support and stimulation while addressing food intake, mitigating the risk of neglect. I will talk briefly about the child protection and food security toolkit that we have developed. I will share the link that practitioners can use if they want to integrate child protection into food security and livelihoods programming. Next slide. So this is a toolkit that has 4 focused areas, which is capacity strengthening, planning and assessment, design and impact, and evidence and learning. So these are the 4 focus areas. And then there are 18 tools that have been tested in the field. They are still being tested, and we're still taking feedback on how they work. It's an effort to try and develop a guidance for practitioners that is flexible, that is evidence-based, that is designed to help teams integrate even under the surge of very difficult conditions. Next slide. So, embedding child protection in climate adaptation helps. It should not come as an add-on. It should be embedded within that. It is not a nice to have. It is a structural requirement for effective response. Without integration, climate adaptation misses the social fallout, and child protection just treats the recurring symptoms. With integration, we address predictable, measurable risk upstream. We treat child protection not as a response to crisis, but as a risk mitigation strategy built on resilient food systems. Thank you. Back to you, Hani.
Thank you so much, Nabiba. Very practical and some real gems in there. I really like the fact that you kept highlighting this link between food security and child protection, because even the data that I presented in the beginning, when we see practitioners report increased risk of child protection, it's not that the situation all of a sudden has changed. It's because there are all these other food security, nutrition, shelter that are also seeing reduced funding that then results in child protection issues. So this linkage between what happens in other sectors and risks of child protection is very important. And also you talked about the very important element of what now is being termed as polycrisis. You talked about South Sudan and how conflict and layering conflict on top of a climate crisis setting creates a multiplicator effect for children. So we are a bit behind, but we will try to jump into our panel discussion. I will invite Audrey, Atia, Neil, and Nabil to stay with us. And of course, other speakers, if they have something to add, either if there's time, come in, or please put it in the chat. So I'll dive straight into a question for Audrey, and then I'll invite Nabil to also address the same question. Audrey, how can climate mitigation and adaptation programs, including climate education and food security and livelihood support, help reduce child protection risks during and after climate shocks? Over to you.
Thank you, Hani. What we've heard from all the speakers really shows that climate shocks amplify protection risks through predictable pathways. They've talked about economic stress, school disruption, displacement, breakdown of community support systems. So I think the question really becomes, how can climate mitigation and adaptation interrupt those pathways before harm escalates? And I would like to highlight 4 shifts so that climate adaptation becomes an opportunity for children, especially those that we know are most at risk. Also, we saw a lot of data initially in the first presentations, and we know the areas, we know the context, but now it's really about finding those children that really do need support. But first, I think climate adaptation must focus not only on the hazards, and you've talked about climate conflict, this multi-hazard approach, but on how all these hazards increase violence and exploitation risk for children and do cause the serious mental health issues that were also highlighted. So climate programs often focus on infrastructure and livelihoods, but they do not explicitly analyze how shocks translate into child marriage, child labor, or all the other forms of violence. So one adaptation program could include school retention, social protection linkages, protection-sensitive design. They interrupt the chain that leads from climate shocks to exploitation. In the second place, I would like to highlight that education continuity can really be a frontline defense. We know that when children stay in school during climate stress, the protection risks decrease. So schools provide structure, supervision, the peer support, and also access to reporting mechanisms. So the climate adaptation that safeguards education continuity is not only protecting the learning, it is stabilizing a key protective environment for the children and the whole community, in fact. I think also that we need to strengthen household resilience to prevent harmful coping. The last presentation highlighted specific strategy as well. We namely know that economic stress is one of the most consistent drivers of early marriage and school withdrawal, and climate adaptation that supports livelihoods, especially women's agency and especially mothers' agency, not only them, but also them. We know they have a higher potential to reduce the pressure on the families to adopt harmful coping mechanisms. And fourth, and I think this is very key and central, we need to recognize children as actors in preparedness. We know that children know better their own situation than their own resources and how to address them, and we need to put them front and center. So children can improve risk communication, influence household behavior, and identify themselves their safety gaps. So institutionalizing child participation in everything climate-related adaptation can really strengthen both the preparedness and our accountability as institutions working for them ultimately. And finally, climate action must protect children in 2 directions. It must reduce the climate-related protection risks, and it must ensure that response mechanisms themselves do not expose children to further harm. It is our own duty as well to ensure that our response are adequate. So that requires strong child protection systems alongside safeguarding and PSEH mechanisms. Namely, climate resilience is not only about surviving the hazards, it is about preventing violence in the face of all of these hazards.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I'll pose the same question, Nabila, to you. You kind of started talking about it in your presentation, so please come in and add.
Thank you. I think from a food security and livelihoods perspective, there is generally that understanding that there is a nexus between climate shocks and child protection risk. And there is almost a causally direct relationship between the two. So climate-induced livelihood failure is a primary stressor and, erodes that household primary buffer against harm. So when you then design a climate mitigation intervention, it ought to take in fundamental child protection mechanisms. Some of the things that we ought to look at is, I think they were just recently mentioned. It is the pre-shock, the anticipatory reaction and shock responses, responsive social protections that we spoke about. Integrating climate triggers into national or social protection system, the cash transfers that we mentioned, allowing for scale up if a disaster strikes, and then scaling out if the peak of the shock is done in that way. It reduces the economic imperative to keep children for child labor, for child marriage, for distress mitigation, and it keeps children within the protective family and the school environments. Livelihood diversification, there's a lot that we can say there. But what happens is the more we promote that livelihood diversification, we are smoothing that income and food availability throughout the year, reduces the household's vulnerability and the whole seasonal fluctuation. So this stabilizes the bedrock upon which child protection is built. Parents are less likely to make irreversible decisions about their children's future when they have diverse and reliable income. I think climate education and green skills, our youth capital development as well, integrating climate education with market-relevant green skills training, regenerative agriculture, solar technology, and so on. It transforms youth from the vulnerable group into agents of change and resilience by providing safe and local pathways to economic independence. Natural resource management, conflict mitigation, again, building that social cohesion within communities will de-escalate resource-based conflicts, and these interventions preserve a safe, stable community environment. And social cohesion is very essential for protecting children from the violence and displacement that often accompanies climate-induced resource scarcity. Then the integration of child protection into a response. This is post-shock, so that this doesn't happen as an afterthought, but it is part of the design. I think it is critical to view climate adaptation not as a separate sectorial activity, but as a primary prevention strategy for child protection. By stabilizing household incomes, economies, diversifying income, building human capital for youth, managing natural resources, peacefully robust food security and livelihoods, climate programs, we dismantle the economic drivers of child labor, child marriage, and family separations, and create that protected environment that we need for children. Thank you. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Some very good solutions were suggested. Now I wanted to ask a little bit about challenges that frontline workers face, particularly in coordinating across child protection, food security, education, and other sectors when they're responding to climate shocks and programming for it, and what kind of support would help for practitioners to be able to bring all of these sectors together to work as a coherent response. Again, Audrey, I'll hand over to you and then back to Nabila before we go to Atiani.
Thank you. I think frontline teams are not struggling because they lack coordination skills. They are struggling because our climate and disaster systems were not designed to integrate child protection, education, and food security in a systematic way. So there are many challenges, but one of the key ones is how our sectors still operate separately. Climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, food security, education, and child protection often sit in different ministries, in different funding streams, and also different coordination platforms. And early warning systems would likely track the rainfall, the crop failure. We talked about heat waves, many different meteorological events, but they rarely track school attendance or protection risks or the rising of, for instance, violence indicators. So as a result, our frontline teams spend significant time just negotiating across structures that were never designed to really work together. So hence all the talk we mentioned now around integration and going against and making different bits and pieces work together. But financing is also not really encouraging integration. We know that climate funding, humanitarian funding, and development funding often come with sector-specific requirements. And this also makes it difficult to design programs that simultaneously address livelihoods, education continuity, and child protection risks. So teams are asked to deliver integrated outcomes, but with fragmented budgets, not to mention that specialists in education or food security would not consider themselves as front and central in a child protection response. They would expect other teams to come in with very specific knowledge, which is true. There are specific expertise elements required, but we really need to have all members of the response identify themselves as frontline and responsible to identify and address these issues. Then another specific challenge, I think, is around the safeguarding risks. So we know this increase when assistance scales up. During climate shocks, when food, cash, or livelihood assistance expands rapidly, also the power imbalances increase. And this requires strong PSEA systems, clear code of conduct, trained staff, self-reporting channels, and community awareness to prevent harm that is linked to the aid delivery. And at the same time, we need to work on broader child protection systems to make sure that referral pathways for SGBV and other forms of violence do remain functional. And these are complementary but distinct systems, and both must be resourced. But we oftentimes see that they become an afterthought, and they're not really. There is a lot we could do in prevention to that. And then again, I'd like to highlight child participation that remains still insufficiently institutionalized. So children are often consulted in projects, but they are rarely embedded in national preparedness or climate adaptation planning. Yet they also are the first to identify the gaps in their safety, in the reporting mechanisms, and in their school environments. We measure rainfall, we measure food insecurity, but we rarely measure whether children trust the systems that are created when they are to protect them. So this is why at the Federation we're working now on developing a child school trust index to assess children's perception of safety and trust in reporting mechanisms during climate shocks. Because resilience is not only about the infrastructure, and I think it's important to highlight that, it's also about whether the children do feel safe, heard, and protected. So what would keep the frontline teams work together more effectively? I think there are three key priorities. Embedding education and child protection within national climate and disaster governance structures. Ensuring climate and adaptation funding allows integrated and multi-sector programming, and continuing our investment in local capacities, the volunteers, the teachers, the community protection mechanisms, the children themselves, so that integration becomes really structural and not personality driven. I think that if climate resilience is to work for children, our systems then definitely must reflect the interconnected nature of the risks they face. Thank you.
Really great points, Audrey, and very interested in that index that you're developing. Nabila, over to you if you can briefly address the same question for us.
Thanks. I'll speak from the food security perspective a lot. I think part of the challenges that we face, I think the first one will be the fundamental mismatch in timing and triggers for both food security and child protection. So the food security early warning systems are designed to predict, crop failure, livestock death, and so on. But for a family in South Sudan or a pastoralist family in Ethiopia, the moment their assets are depleted is the exact moment that that child is pulled out of school into a hazardous labor. A doctor is married off to reduce the household stress. That's the vulnerability gap, the 6 to 18 months following a drought or flood. So the problem is the response systems are not aligned. Food aid arrives, but child protection workforce is often not activated or funded to operate in that same window. We are treating the hunger, but we are missing the predictable erosion of safety that follows it. I think the second part is we're operating with data that is not interoperable. Food security teams will track livestock prices, rainfall anomalies, market volatility. Child protection teams will track separation, violence, child labor. But we have seen, I think there was evidence that was presented, especially the longitudinal data that is showing us that consecutive harvest failures lead directly to caregiver migration, children are left behind. But in real time, it is very difficult to see that connection. So protection teams, most of the times, will not see livelihood data that could trigger the preemptive cash transfer that will keep that family safe. Food security teams don't see the protection data that will reveal a spike in exploitation at a specific distribution point. We are collecting the right information, as what Audrey has just said, but we are not sharing it in a way that enables us to make joint action and the right decisions. So what do we need to do? I think first we need joint responses, shock responses, triggers. When a drought is forecast, early warning systems should automatically trigger not just a food security response, but a pre-positioned protection protocol. This means your cash transfer is already designed with child-sensitive conditions, including what Audrey mentioned, the child consultation, and everything is embedded with protection to monitor alongside food distribution as a standard practice, not just as an add-on. Second, we need integrated programming that addresses the economic driver of harm. If the household is marrying off the daughter because of a livelihood collapse, a community awareness campaign alone will fail. That family needs economic support in that vulnerability gap to remove that desperate need for that coping strategy. So we need livelihood interventions that are intentionally designed with child protection outcomes and protection interventions that address the root causes of the stress. And finally, our management information systems might be able to speak to each other. A food security officer should be able to see that in a drought-affected area, adolescent girls are disappearing from school. A protection officer should be able to see that a spike in child labor correlates with a spike in livestock mortality, for instance. Without that shared operational picture, we will always be reacting to crises instead of preventing them. The evidence base exists. We know the patterns. The question is whether we are aligning our systems to match the realities children are facing. Thanks.
Well, the way you put it, it feels like such a no-brainer that the data has to be shared. We have to be talking to each other. But in reality, we have created these silos that are so rigid. And then who pays the price is the families and children. So really a great call for integration and true collaboration across sectors. With that, I would like to now turn to Atiya and then Neil to help us, based on your kind of research findings and experience, what are the top actions governments, donors, and other development and humanitarian actors should take to ensure that climate adaptation and disaster preparedness and response efforts meaningfully reduce and mitigate risks to children and their protection? Over to you, Atiya.
Thanks. Coming right after Audrey and Kobile, it's put it all out there so easily, and God, if only it all worked so smoothly. But I mean, I agree. I think the very first thing that we really need to do is build widespread agreement that climate shocks are increasing exploitation and violence of children, where at the community and family and local government level. See, for me, I have the advantage of working very, very locally, right? I work in an area which is a climate hazard zone. So the periods, like what does it mean to say this is the time which is post-disaster and this is the pre-disaster and this is the, it's in so many parts of India, that's what we're seeing. Like everybody's just living continuously in the cycle of pre or post-disaster or climate shock, right? So we're just taking the attitude of saying, just work with local government, help them to see the connection and embed systems inside whatever exists, because I think this thing of fragmented budgets and who's paying for what becomes really impossible, and I think is quite opaque for good I don't think it's on accident that they're such opaque systems. So like for communities on the ground, I think what has worked for us, what the strategies that have worked for us, is that we've actually worked with communities to see the connection and make the demand themselves. So when communities are demanding child protection and understanding the risk and making the demand from themselves, of their local governments, then there is a different kind of pressure to act and to perform. So I would say that's one very, very important thing. I think the other super important thing is creating local mechanisms that are able to listen regularly to children and young people. Audrey, you talked about child participation, and I'm taking this one step further. This is not just about participation. This is about having mechanisms that are regular, and you have to set them up in advance. This is not something that kicks in post the crisis. This is something that is routine, that children get used to, that young people get used to. This is how you stop normalizing the harm that for generations people have normalized. So you've got to set up systems by which children are heard with an intention to act, because oftentimes you'll have mechanisms to listen, but not really mechanisms to act. So the person who's doing the listening has got to have the wherewithal to act. And I think that the third thing that has worked sort of, I don't know, very successfully, sort of successfully for us, has been really this, embedding child safety into local governance. And that's in partnership with communities and their different local authorities, so that there is a kind of forced convergence that happens on the ground, not because the powers that be determined it somewhere up there, but just because on the ground people are demanding it. And so that, if a local, for us, what did it look like? It looked like a local village council understanding and recognizing that vast numbers of children remain unsupervised. And so they got their frontline workers in education and health to actually look out for unsupervised children and report back while they're in the course of their normal work. So it's really about being able to assign specific duties and responsibilities to people, and that's how sort of forcing it. I talked earlier about isolation and loneliness that young people face and how that exacerbates risk-taking. Peer support networks, like, it sounds banal, but really effective. And those all have to be set up in advance, and they have to be functional, and people have to trust and be able to use them. Just to say that, in the time that we've been working with using some of these strategies, like, I can say very safely, communities have managed to bring 1,000 children back to school and stopped more than 130 child marriages and prevented 500 children from being in exploitative child labor. It's a drop in the ocean, I know, but all it does is it tells you that, these are possible. And there's no silver bullet, but I think what's really important for anyone who's looking at the intersection, or anyone who's looking at climate action and child protection, is I think there's a couple of questions you've got to be able to ask yourself. One is, how will our strategy, solution, intervention specifically impact the safety, health, and well-being of children, especially the most vulnerable children? Do we know the fears and concerns of the community of children and their families with regard to these issues? Does the approach that we're intending to take, does it increase unintentionally or create new challenges for children and their families? And then lastly, does our solution ensure long-term resilience for children and their families, specifically looking, at basic survival needs, safety, family and community connection, and education? So I think if we're able to continuously ask ourselves these questions, because I think strategies are going to be local, and we have to really be open to that, and empower people at a very, very local level to be able to talk to government and build solutions together. So I think that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you so much for that, reiterating the importance of having the communities come up with the solutions, but also those guiding questions that you put out, I think, are very helpful. Neil, over to you for the same question.
Great. I think it's been really interesting to hear this whole discussion. And to come back to what we're trying to do in our piece of work, it's really about taking the qualitative strength of all the evidence that exists that everyone's discussed here today, adding more quantitative evidence to that so we can actually have numbers. And in doing that, one of the things we've been very interested in trying to start is to think about how things like food security, food prices overlay with the data that in this case we're getting from the violence against children surveys. And I can only echo everything that Mobile said, because we are finding it very difficult to quantitatively find the appropriate index of food insecurity or food pricing, and link it with the violence risks. So that integration is very important. And I don't want to add anything to what Mobile said, but just to say what he said is very important, both from the research perspective. A lot of this is about the protection. And I think that, there's been a lot that's been said by Audrey, Mobile, and others, which speaks about both adaptation and anticipatory action. And this has certainly been the way we're thinking about it. We're trying to understand, for example, where anticipatory action has happened in the past, how has that modified the risk? And so if a cash transfer to support livestock farmers took place, to what extent did this mitigate the child protection risk? And given changes to funding, I think that integration is even more important. It's not the space I'm working in, but I understand that OCHA remains funded in a way that some of the other agencies may not. And so how anticipatory action and those triggers are both having the co-benefit of child protection is really important. And that's in advance of a particular crisis. We're also thinking about that more longer-term climate adaptation aspect, which I think is really important, and ways in which, enhancing school gardens, for example. There's projects I know where water points in communities are actually being attached to schools such that the school becomes this focal point and might help support more children staying in school. How we support both of these, the longer term adaptation, community resilience building, and the actual anticipatory action with triggers, really important. And I think a lot has been said about that. I think one thing which I haven't heard and is probably worth mentioning is about urban environments. So, for example, when we've done work looking at the heat index, the impact of increased heat exposure on risks of sexual violence, we end up that for a particular region, if that heat exposure goes to the maximum that you might expect for a particular region, it has the same effect as increasing the sexual violence risk an adolescent might have, moving from a rural area to an urban area. And when we're thinking about protection, a lot of the discussion has, for example, been around food livelihoods in agricultural settings. What about in the urban environment? And I think that's where it comes into thinking about parenting programs. Mobile mentioned work on programs enhancing positive masculinity, working with fathers. I think there's a whole lot of programming there which might be quite important as well, because when we talk about those population growth in Africa, a huge number of those people will be living in urban environments and informal or semi-informal settlements. So I think those are the only comments I have on that. From our perspective and the work we're doing, it would be very valuable, and please use the Q&A or the chat if there are any specific research questions which would be helpful from your operational standpoints that we should be working on, that we should be asking. This work that we've started has really come from the Alliance partners, and we'd be very interested to hear things that would be helpful if we can go away and work on while you guys are trying to make sense of how to integrate across anticipatory action, development, climate adaptation.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil. Actually, there is a question on research in the Q&A, and I encourage you, I don't know if you will have time to get to it. I'm going to ask one question, and I will particularly encourage Mona and Isabel, who haven't spoken on this part of the session, to come in if they have any thoughts on it. But Neil, there's a second question in the Q&A that is specifically on research. If you want to take a look at it, and if you have time, I would invite you to come in on that as well. But the first question that has been posted is about suggestions, and I think some of it we have already addressed in some of the discussions, but it would be great if Mona and Isabel can bring some fresh perspective as well. What works in the child protection sector to prevent or mitigate climate impact on child protection, or on how to respond to it? What interventions work? The linkage being indirect or exacerbating existing vulnerabilities or risks without creating new ones is a challenge for child protection to find its place in the climate change financing agenda. So if either of you would like to come in, and if not, anyone else.
I think it's such a good question, Hani. So we're talking about two different worlds here, right? We're talking about kind of interventions that are meant for child protection that should now be adapted to humanitarian contexts. And we're also talking about how climate interventions can affect child protection. One thing that I've noticed, for example, IFRC and World Vision are trying to do is look at the impacts of non-child programming on children. So I know World Vision in Ethiopia is looking at farmer reintegration into kind of in areas that are affected by desertification. Does a program like that affect children? Potentially, we don't know. So how can we really think creatively in this space on how to improve child well-being, even when we don't use our traditional tools or traditional interventions? And I know people kind of say this a lot. It's a bit of a silver lining to a very gray cloud, but some of the funding cuts are really pushing us to think about these overlaps. So I'm curious to what Isabel thinks as well. But in my view, we should really try to see both worlds together. And of course, any recommendations on interventions to look at, share them in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you. Over to you, Isabella, if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that's also what Mona said. I think this was an interesting finding of the second year. So last year already, the impact of the budget cuts on humanitarian action, and also seeing how many of the interventions had very short-term impact. So yeah, this is also one of the goals of this longitudinal study. We're assessing and monitoring and evaluating different interventions implemented by different organizations, and hoping to see the impact also after these interventions stop. So yeah, hopefully I can tell you a bit more about this in the next few years as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. There are other questions. I also had a couple of questions that I wanted to pose, but for the sake of time, we'll move towards closing. Really a huge thank you for everyone who stayed with us throughout an hour and a half. About 60 people are still here. Some people probably had to jump off at the top of the hour, which we understand. Atia, Neil, Mona, Isabella, Audrey, Nabila, thank you so much. And before I hand over to Manami and Pedro to close, just to say how much work has gone into this by primarily Pedro and Manami and Elena in the background. So a huge thank you to all of those who have been behind this and have helped make it happen. With that, I would like to hand back over to Manami and Pedro to close the session.
Yeah, Hani, and thank you so much for all the speakers to bring in such insightful discussion from the research perspectives to practical elements. So I hope this session gave some insights and thought-provoking. It was thought-provoking for all the participants. I put the link to the community of practice in the chat, where we can continue our discussion and hopefully to have answers to the second question, maybe from Nell and Mona, in the thread, we have created a dedicated thread discuss for continued discussion for this session. And before you jump off, we'd love to hear your feedback to this session. So Pedro, thank you. If you can take 1 minute to answer the questions in the poll, that would be lovely. But thank you for joining this session. And while we hear from the participants on this session, while we collect some feedback from the participants on this session, we have 3 minutes left. I don't know, Hani, if you'd like to invite Neil to actually answer the second question.
Sure. Neil,
Great.
did you have a look at it?
Yeah, so I've just put in the Q&A that the violence against children surveys we use very extensively, and they're excellent at capturing this multi-dimension nature of risk. And so, to be very clear about what we're doing, we're not saying climate change causes this violence risk. The baseline risks are very different country to country, and they're very different based on urban-rural poverty indicators, and it's the extent to which climate risks may enhance that baseline risk. And VAX has been excellent in achieving that, but from what I understand, it's no longer funded. So a way to reestablish that type of survey protocol would be excellent. The other challenge, of course, is that VAX are snapshots in time. So because they're across country, different countries, we can in that way determine changes in baseline risk based on when the surveys were taken and what climate risks happened in the past 12 months. But more longitudinal data would be incredibly valuable. There are individual countries where this does exist, and we are trying to play with that data as well now. But yeah, I think that's sufficient response to what Justine said, is that we have to have all of that in order to, as Mona presented, look at the way in which in education or out of education, child marriage or not, all of these factors change the risk profile of different adolescents and children to given climate shocks.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. And I would have liked to explore a bit more, Neil, with you and others, this question of how do we increase the reliability of our data, both in terms of accessing those children that are less visible and which are typically the most vulnerable children, but also what Atia was presenting in making sure that the way we ask the questions brings out those difficult realities that we need to know about the realities of children. Sometimes it is by talking to children themselves, which oftentimes also comes with its own struggles and problems, but then also having other methodologies that allow us to really get to the heart and the core of the problems without making it too complex for practitioners, so they can't actually do it because it's way too complex for them. If you have any thoughts on that, quick, please come in. If not, we'll close the session.
I would hand that to Mona. I think she might have perhaps a better off-the-cuff answer about that.
I think I just wanted to flag that potentially forums like COP, forums like climate sort of spaces that that are focused on humanitarianism are potentially spaces where we could start asking these questions more actively. So that it's not just about industry, but it's about kind of the future of child well-being across the world. But it's not really an answer, but it's potentially kind of an opportunity to discuss.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, everyone. Manami, over to you to close.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for all. We are looking forward to continuing this discussion in the community of practice. So please feel free to register and join our discussion. Thank you very much, and have a good day all. Thank you.